Hell had a schedule. Every year, like clockwork, the sky tore open and angels descended to cull the population. Sinners knew the drill. Hide if you could, fight if you were stupid, die if you were unlucky. Then the portal closed, the bodies dissolved, and everyone went back to their afterlives until the next annual appointment with extinction. Katie Killjoy's face filled every screen in Pentagram City, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. Tom Trench sat beside her, nodding with the enthusiasm of a man who'd learned that disagreeing with Katie led to on-air dismemberment. "Breaking news that'll make you shit yourself," Katie announced, her grin widening. Heavens moved up the extermination timeline, 6 months instead of 12. That's half the survival time for you math-illiterate degenerates. Tom shuffled his papers. Sources indicate the decision came from... Nobody cares about your sources, Tom. Katie turned back to the camera. Adam himself confirmed it. The first man wants hell cleaned up faster. Overpopulation uprising risks the usual heaven PR nonsense about keeping the afterlife tidy. The broadcast cut to footage of panicked demons flooding the streets. Overlords barricaded territories. Weapons dealers saw their stock vanish in hours. The IMP office tripled its rates for protection contracts. Vox watched the chaos from his tower fingers' steepled screens multiplying around him like digital flies. Every monitor showed a different angle of the same beautiful disaster. Panic sold. Fear drove engagement. His advertising algorithms were already spinning the terror into revenue streams. 6 months. He murmured, his screen face flickering with satisfaction. That's a lot of desperate sinners with money to spend. The ticker at the bottom of every broadcast scrolled the same information on loop. Extermination date. Countdown timer. Survival tips that amounted to pray you're not noticed. Standard hell media satire where the apocalypse came with commercial breaks. But buried in the chaos of the broadcast, for exactly 1 frame, different text appeared. Who authorized this edit? Not a glitch, not a hack. A watermark that didn't belong to any known system. It appeared and vanished so quickly that only someone watching for impossibilities would catch it. Alastor caught it. The radio demon stood in the Hazbin hotel lobby. His perpetual grin, unchanged but static, crackled across his shoulders. His head tilted slightly the way a predator notices movement in tall grass. Well now, he said to no one in particular. That's interesting. Charlie Morningstar stood frozen in front of the same broadcast, her hands clenched. 6 months. She'd been fighting to prove redemption was possible, that sinners could change, that her hotel wasn't just naive idealism wrapped in stained glass and good intentions. But 6 months didn't leave time for gradual transformation. 6 months meant accelerated everything, and acceleration meant corners. Cut standards lowered, desperation creeping in. Vaggie appeared at her shoulder. We can't speed this up. Redemption doesn't work on a deadline. Then we make it work. Charlie's voice carried the kind of determination that preceded either miracles or disasters. We've got the hotel. We've got the program. We just need to prove it before. The lights flickered. Not the usual hell power grid inconsistency. This was different. A pulse that seemed to originate from nowhere and everywhere, a ripple in the foundation of things. The kind of disturbance that suggested something had just tested the structural integrity of reality itself. In the ceiling above the hotel lobby, a crack appeared. Microscopic. Thinner than spider silk. It glowed for half a heartbeat with light that had no business existing in hell's red-soaked atmosphere, then sealed itself and vanished as though it had never been. No one saw it, except Alistair, whose grin stretched slightly wider. The city continued its spiral into preparation mode. Carmilla Carmine's weapon shipments quadrupled. Rosie's Emporium saw a run on preservation spells. The V's consolidated their territorial claims, knowing that post-extermination real estate would be valuable for whoever survived. In a penthouse somewhere in Pride, Lucifer Morningstar, king of hell, fallen angel father who'd spent the last several years avoiding his daughter's phone calls, stared at his own collection of screens. He'd built hell's bureaucracy. He knew every system, every protocol, every carefully negotiated treaty between heaven and his domain. The extermination schedule wasn't supposed to change. It was fixed. Locked. One of the few things both sides had agreed on after the initial war ended. Annual purges to prevent hell from becoming overcrowded enough to pose a genuine threat. A compromise that let heaven pretend they were maintaining order, while hell pretended they had any say in the matter. Someone had rewritten the agreement, and Lucifer hadn't authorized it. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then set it down again. Calling Charlie meant admitting he'd been monitoring hell's systems, instead of, say, being a present parent. It meant explanations he wasn't ready to give, and conversations he'd been postponing for years. The phone rang anyway. "Dad." Charlie's voice came through with a kind of forced cheerfulness that meant she was either terrified or about to ask for something impossible. "I need your help." Lucifer picked up a rubber duck from his desk, squeezing it gently. It squeaked. He'd been building an army of them lately, each one slightly different. Each one a small act of creation that didn't require him to engage with the larger responsibilities he'd been avoiding. "The extermination," he said. "You saw. Hard to miss." He set the duck down. "What do you need?" "I need you to come to the hotel. I need you to see what we're building. I need—" She paused. "I need my father to believe this matters." The words hit harder than she probably intended. Lucifer looked around his workshop at the countless rubber ducks, at the evidence of years spent in self-imposed isolation. He'd given Charlie hell itself, and then vanished from her life like a deadbeat with cosmic-scale avoidance issues. "I'll come," he said quietly. Charlie's surprised silence spoke volumes. "Tomorrow," Lucifer continued. "I'll come to the hotel tomorrow." After she hung up, he sat in the silence of his penthouse, surrounded by rubber ducks and the weight of choices made and unmade. Outside hell continued its countdown. 6 months until heaven's gates unsealed and the killing resumed. But something else had shifted. Something small and wrong and outside the usual patterns. That text in the broadcast. That unauthorized edit. Lucifer had ruled hell for millennia. He knew every system, every loophole, every back door in the cosmic bureaucracy. And he knew with absolute certainty that whatever had just changed the extermination timeline hadn't come from heaven. It hadn't come from hell either, which left a question he didn't have an answer for, and questions without answers had a way of becoming problems. The rubber duck on his desk stared at him with painted eyes. "Yeah," Lucifer told it. "I don't like it either." Across the city in the Hazbin hotel, the impossible crack in the ceiling remained invisible. Sealed. Waiting. And somewhere beyond the boundaries of what hell understood as reality, something had noticed the edit too. Something that had been following a trail of unauthorized changes across framework. And finding at the end of that trail a world where angels killed sinners on a schedule and called it divine maintenance. The audit had already begun. Hell just didn't know it yet. The dimensional wound pulsed wider. What had been 15 meters now stretched to 50, the breach stabilizing as Sephiroth channeled stolen Necron anchor technology into its edges. Mathematical absolutes etched themselves into the fabric of space, holding the rupture open against reality's natural healing. He floated in the void, between universes, drawing power from the chaos erupting around him. 3 fleets converged on his position. Imperial Navy assets Retribution's Hammer and its escort squadron maintained firing solutions with lance batteries hot and torpedo tubes loaded. Lord Admiral Holt's tactical display showed optimal bombardment vectors, but she held fire. Inquisitor Kessel had ordered containment before destruction, and containment required understanding what they faced. From the opposite vector, Chaos warships translated into real space, trailing corruption and screaming warp stuff. Black Legion cruisers bearing Abaddon's 8-pointed star, their hulls festooned with bones and prayer strips written in languages that drove reading servitors insane. They had come to claim the entity that had suture wounds in reality to bind it as a tool for the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade. And from the third approach, Necron tomb ships, their living metal hulls, older than human civilization. The stolen node architecture triggered response directives coded into tomb fleet consciousness millions of years before humanity's ancestors had discovered fire. Retrieve technology, eliminate thieves, resume dormancy. 3 forces, 3 objectives, 0 coordination. The battle ignited. Imperial lance batteries spoke first. Coherent light carved through vacuum targeting chaos vessels with prejudice born from 10,000 years of religious hatred. Void shields flared on Black Legion cruisers, absorbing energy that could have carved continents. The Necrons responded with Gauss arrays that stripped matter at the atomic level. Green lightning arced across void space, intersecting Imperial torpedo volleys and reducing the warheads to constituent elements before detonation. Retribution's Hammer's void shields buckled under the assault emergency power rerouting to maintain defensive integrity. Chaos answered both with warp fire. Demon engines aboard the Black Legion flagship discharged reality-bending energies that ignored conventional physics. Immaterial flames washed over Necron hull plating, seeking consciousness to corrupt. The tomb ships registered the assault as irritating, but ineffective Necrons possessed no souls to twist. Sephiroth observed the 3-way carnage and prepared his ascension. The dimensional wound connected him to Gaia's soul ocean. That vast reservoir of spiritual essence, the life stream, flowed into him like water into a drought-stricken vessel. Not the corrupt madness of the warp, but pure concentrated existence distilled from a world where life and death formed cycles instead of screaming chaos. His form began to shift. Additional limbs erupted from his torso, each one perfect and terrible. Wings manifested not biological tissue, but condensed will shaped into membranes that caught dimensional currents. His single blade multiplied each weapon, a reflection of Masamune held in hands that should not exist on a baseline human frame. Proto-Safer, the threshold between flesh and concept. Not yet the angel of despair he would become, but no longer constrained by single-body limitations. Aboard Retribution's Hammer Navigator, Pelles shrieked as his warp-attuned consciousness touched the life stream flowing through the breach. The foreign essence flooded his third eye, seeking harmonization with something that operated according to completely different principles. His neural architecture optimized for immaterium navigation, shattered trying to process clean soul energy that had never known chaos. Blood wept from his forehead. His attendants rushed forward, but the damage was irreversible. Pelles collapsed another casualty to incompatibility between dimensions. Lord Admiral Holt received the casualty report and marked it. Navigator lost. Warp transit capability compromised. Fleet mobility reduced by 40%. The cost of this engagement climbed with every passing second. Inquisitor, she voxed to Kessel aboard his personal vessel. We cannot sustain this. 3 hostile fleet elements, dimensional anomaly, expanding navigator core, taking catastrophic losses from proximity to the breach. Recommend immediate exterminatus level response. Kessel's response came sharp. Denied. The anomaly must be contained, not destroyed. Destroying it may destabilize the entire subsector's warp geography. We seal it. Now. He activated fleet-wide command frequency. All vessels, this is Inquisitor Lord Kessel, invoking Ordo Malleus authority. Disengage from hostile fleets and focus all assets on dimensional breach containment. Grey Knights execute closure rights. Sisters of Silence maximum null field projection. Navy prepare for directed bombardment on my authorization. The Imperial forces shifted formation. This close to the breach, the life stream's influence made warp-based tactics unreliable. Psychers aboard every ship registered feedback that ranged from disorienting to lethal. But the Sisters of Silence, those psychic voids in human form, found their innate anti-warp nature suddenly amplified. Where the life stream met their null aura, both forces canceled into perfect absence. Sister Superior Novena stood in the teleportarium aboard the strike cruiser. Emperor's Judgment, surrounded by 14 of her sisters. Their pariah genes created a bubble of absolute psychic silence that expanded as tech priests activated null field amplifiers to maximum output. "Prepare for combat insertion," she signed to her squad. "Target breach epicenter. Mission anchor, null field, at dimensional wound edge. Duration until rites complete or termination." The teleport homers engaged. Novena materialized in hard vacuum 15 meters from where Sephiroth floated in his transforming state. The life stream flowing around him recoiled from the sister's presence like living tissue shrinking from flame. A sphere of dead space formed around the pariahs, cutting him off from the soul ocean that fed his ascension. Sephiroth felt the connection sever. The power sustaining his transformation guttered. His additional limbs began to dissolve, manifestation failing, without continuous spiritual fuel. He turned his attention to the sisters with cold recognition. They were weapons specifically designed to kill what he was becoming. Acceptable. He moved. Even reduced to near baseline capability, he remained apex predator. Masamune swept through vacuum in an arc calculated to intersect multiple targets, despite Void Combat's lack of air resistance to guide movement. One sister died, her helmet breached and flash frozen before her nervous system registered the cut. The others returned fire. Bolters spoke in silence, muzzle flares the only indication of discharge. Mass reactive shells converged on Sephiroth from 8 vectors simultaneously. He dodged 6, deflected one with his blade. The 8th struck his shoulder, detonating against flesh and bone with force that would have crippled unaugmented humans. Sephiroth's regeneration sealed the wound, but slower now. Without the life stream, his biology reverted to limits. The sisters pressed their advantage, maintaining null field cohesion, while firing disciplined volleys that forced him into defensive patterns. Aboard the strike cruiser, Justicar Thane led his Grey Knight strike team through final preparations. The teleportation would deposit them at the breach's edge, where they would execute the rite of dimensional severance, a liturgy so potent that speaking it wrong could tear the ritualist's soul from their body. "Brothers," Thane spoke through Helmet Vox, "we have faced this entity before. It adapted. It learned. It demonstrated capacity that exceeds standard threat models. But it is not invulnerable. The sisters have proven that." His squad responded with unified acknowledgement. 10 Grey Knights, each bearing weapons blessed against every known form of corruption. They teleported. Reality folded. The Grey Knights materialized in formation around the dimensional wound, their Aegis armor's wards blazing with active power. They began the rite immediately, voices synchronized through Vox Link to maintain perfect liturgical harmony. The words they spoke were older than the Imperium recovered from Dark Age archives that predated the Emperor's unification of Terra. Each syllable carried weight that pressed against the immaterial like hammers shaping steel. The dimensional wound shuddered. Sephiroth felt the change immediately. The mathematics holding the breach open began to invert the Grey Knight's rite, rewriting fundamental principles. The wound no longer pulled open. It pushed closed dimensional barriers, reasserting themselves according to liturgical command. But the rite also did something else. It redirected the flow. The life stream pouring through the breach found its vector reversed. Instead of flowing into Imperial space, the soul energy now pushed back toward Gaia, creating spiritual back pressure that threatened to destabilize the entire rupture. Sephiroth recognized the trap. They were not trying to kill him through force. They were converting the breach into a one-way channel that would expel him back to Gaia's dimension, while simultaneously sealing the wound behind him. Banishment through spatial geometry and theological manipulation. He attempted to counter, but the sister's null field prevented him from accessing the power needed to resist. His proto-Safer form collapsed entirely, leaving him in baseline human configuration. Wounded, depleted, facing coordinated assault from forces that had solved his threat profile. Lord Admiral Holt received Justicar Thane's signal right, achieving desired effect dimensional wound, now configured for expulsion rather than access. She spoke the words that would end this. All batteries. Target dimensional breach edges with sustained lance fire. Maximum yield. Authorization Inquisitor Kessel Ordo Malleus. 23 lance batteries opened fire simultaneously. Coherent light beams converged on the breach's spatial boundaries, the specific coordinates where Thane's right had weakened dimensional integrity. The bombardment did not target Sephiroth. It targeted the wound itself, hammering the space-time fabric that the Grey Knights had already softened through liturgy. The breach began to collapse, not the slow, natural healing, but forced closure under directed energy that followed the vectors Grey Knight ritual had established. The wound contracted dimensional edges, pulling toward each other with increasing speed. Sephiroth had seconds to decide, resist, and be crushed between collapsing dimensional barriers, or retreat through the rupture to Gaia before it sealed completely. He chose survival. His form accelerated toward the breach, crossing back through the threshold, even as the wound compressed around him. The sister's null field released its hold. The life stream embraced him once more, pulling him back into Gaia's dimension with force amplified by the Grey Knight's redirection. He tumbled through blue sky, fell toward ocean below. The breach sealed above him, with a sound like reality remembering how to be whole. Aboard Retribution's hammer, Lord Admiral Holt watched the dimensional wound close completely. Auspex confirmed no residual tears, no lingering instabilities, no connection between Imperial space and whatever lay beyond. She logged the engagement dimensional anomaly contained through coordinated Ordo Malleus operation. Casualties acceptable. Threat neutralized. Inquisitor Kessel stood beside her, augmetic eye reviewing battle recordings that would be sealed under Vermilion clearance and forgotten by official history. Mark Gaia's coordinates as Perditus Absolute. Any future detection of similar dimensional breaches in that vector is to trigger immediate exterminatus of the surrounding volume. Understood, Inquisitor? Holt turned to her tactical officer. Disengage from hostile fleet elements. All vessels assume defensive formation and prepare for warp transit once navigators recover. The Imperial fleet withdrew, leaving the Chaos and Necron forces to murder each other without interference. The Black Legion had lost their prize. The Necrons had failed to recover stolen technology. Both would claim victory in their own chronicles, while Imperial records would note only anomaly purged. Sector secured. On Gaia's surface, Sephiroth pulled himself from the ocean. His body bore wounds that would take days to fully regenerate. The knowledge he had stolen remained intact, but the dimensional wound was gone. His pathway to exploiting Imperial purges had been sealed by enemies who understood that overwhelming force was less effective than surgical precision. He stood on a beach unmarked by millennia of war and looked toward sky that showed no tear, no breach, no connection to the universe he had briefly touched. The Imperium had won this engagement through doctrine and coordination. But Gaia remained accessible. The life stream still flowed. And Sephiroth now understood exactly how the Imperium fought threats they could not simply destroy. They adapted, they studied, they systematized. So would he. Overhead clouds drifted across skies that had never known orbital bombardment. The ocean breathed. And in the place where dimensional barriers had torn open, a scar remained invisible to normal perception, but permanent in the fabric of existence. The Imperium had closed the wound. But scars remember pressure, and wounds once opened never truly forget how to bleed. The Imperium sealed its records. Sanctus Heliara became a footnote marked Exterminatus Xenos Incursion. 3 billion deaths filed under acceptable losses. The dimensional breach classified as perditus absolute, coordinates flagged for immediate purge if detected again. But some things cannot be erased through administrative decree. Inquisitor Kessel's sealed reports circulated among Ordo Malleus archives. A new threat category emerged, entities exhibiting non-warp metaphysical capabilities, immune to standard psychic countermeasures, requiring null contingent response protocols. The Grey Knights updated their combat doctrines. The Sisters of Silence found their strategic value reassessed. Across the segmentum, astropaths whispered of silver threads in the immaterium places where dimensional barriers remembered being cut. Navigators reported anomalous readings near former conflict zones. Spatial scars that refused to heal according to natural law. And on Gaia, in an ocean untouched by Imperial fire, something patient studied the techniques used against it. The Imperium had taught valuable lessons about systematic warfare, coordinated doctrine, and the power of turning apocalypse into opportunity. Sephiroth would not forget those lessons. Neither would the scars. The Hazbin Hotel had seen its share of unlikely guests. Sinners seeking redemption, overlords seeking entertainment, demons seeking refuge from the next purge. But it had never hosted royalty with an actual invitation. Charlie paced the lobby, checking the clock every 30 seconds. Her father had agreed to visit. Her father, the king of hell. The same king who'd spent the last decade avoiding her calls and pretending rubber duck engineering was a valid excuse for parental absence. Vaggie watched from the bar, arms crossed. He's probably not coming. He said he would, and you believe him. Charlie's optimism flickered, but held. He's my dad. He wouldn't. The lobby doors swung open with theatrical flair. Lucifer Morningstar entered like a performer, hitting his mark on opening night. White suit, gold trim, apple-topped cane twirling in one hand. His grin was wide and slightly manic, the smile of someone who'd rehearsed this entrance for maximum impact, but wasn't quite sure how to follow through. Charlie. He spread his arms magic, sparking from his fingertips in tiny golden bursts. My little girl all grown up and running a hotel for... He glanced around. The morally flexible. Alastair materialized from the shadows near the staircase, his permanent smile widening. Your Majesty? How delightful. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten where your daughter lived. Lucifer's eye twitched. And you are Alastair, the radio demon, facility manager. He gestured broadly. Though manager seems such a pedestrian term for what I do here. Right. Lucifer turned back to Charlie, pointedly ignoring the radio demon. So, this redemption thing, you really think you can... The chandeliers dimmed, not flickered, dimmed. A smooth, deliberate reduction in brightness that had nothing to do with Hell's electrical infrastructure and everything to do with something adjusting the ambient light to suit its presence. No one noticed at first. Charlie was too focused on her father. Vaggie was watching Alastair. Alastair was watching everything, because that's what Alastair did. But then someone else was standing near the piano. He hadn't walked in. He was simply there as though he'd been waiting patiently for the conversation to pause long enough for him to be acknowledged. Dark suit, crisp white shirt, no embellishments. Where Lucifer has been dressed like a showman, this figure dressed like a lawyer about to inform you that the contract you'd signed had very specific fine print. Charlie blinked. Dad, Lucifer Hazbin frowned. I'm right here, sweetheart. Then who's... The stranger spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, precise, and carried the kind of authority that didn't need volume. I apologize for the intrusion. I was following a trail. Vaggie's spear materialized in her hands. How did you get in here? Through a gap. He glanced at the ceiling where, 24 hours ago, a microscopic crack had briefly existed. One that shouldn't have formed. One that indicated unauthorized alterations to structural agreements. Lucifer Hazbin's expression shifted from confusion to something sharper. You're impersonating me. That's my entire brand, my face. I'm not impersonating anyone. The stranger's attention fixed on Hell's King with the clinical interest of an auditor discovering discrepancies in a ledger, though I admit the resemblance is unexpected. Alastair laughed a sound like radio static hitting a crescendo. Oh, this is magnificent. 2 Lucifers. The dramatic possibilities alone. Shut up, Alastair. Lucifer Hazbin stepped forward, power flaring gold around his fingers. I don't know what kind of stunt you're pulling, but nobody steals my identity in my daughter's hotel. The stranger didn't move, didn't tense. Just watched the display of angelic power with mild curiosity. Your extermination protocol, he said. The one governing annual purges. It contains specific clauses about temporal consistency. Modifications require bilateral agreement between heaven and hell's administrative bodies. Authorization signatures from both domains. Lucifer Hazbin's magic faltered. How do you know that? Because someone violated it. The purge cycle was shortened from 12 months to 6 without proper procedure. I traced the alteration here. He paused, studying Hell's King with something that might have been recognition, and found a world where my name belongs to someone else. A faint smile crossed his face, more curious than amused. So, this world also contains another version of me. The statement landed with the weight of genuine surprise, wrapped in perfect composure. The silence that followed had weight. Charlie's voice came out small. Wait. Are you saying you're also Lucifer Morningstar? The stranger inclined his head slightly, though apparently not the only one. Vaggy's spear didn't lower. That's impossible. Many things are impossible until they become inconvenient. His gaze swept the room, taking in the threadbare elegance, the stained glass, the desperate hope embedded in every refurbished corner. You're attempting redemption. An admirable goal. Futile, perhaps, but admirable. It's not futile, Charlie said, finding her voice. Sinners can change. They deserve a chance to. Deserve has nothing to do with it. His tone wasn't cruel, just matter of fact. The question isn't whether they deserve redemption. The question is whether anyone has the right to deny them the choice. Lucifer Hazbin stared at his doppelganger. You're not from hell. No. Not from heaven either. Correct. Then where? Somewhere your cosmology doesn't account for. The stranger's attention shifted back to Hell's King. And for the first time, something that might have been interest flickered in his expression. Tell me, do you rule because you chose to, or because refusing would have violated the role assigned to you when you fell? The words landed like a surgical strike. Lucifer Hazbin's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Anger, confusion, something uncomfortably close to recognition. That's not. He stopped, started again. I chose to leave heaven. You chose to fall. Did you choose what came after? The stranger's voice remained level, almost gentle. Did you choose to build hell's bureaucracy to negotiate treaties with the beings who cast you out, to become the administrator of punishment rather than its architect? Charlie moved between them. Stop it. You don't know anything about him. The stranger looked at her, and his expression softened fractionally. You're right. I apologize. Family dynamics are not my concern. He turned back to Lucifer Hazbin. My concern is why heaven felt authorized to rewrite agreed-upon protocols without consultation, and why that rewrite created a tear significant enough for me to notice. Alastair's grin had frozen in place, his usual amusement replaced by something more calculating. You're not here for the hotel. No. Then what do you want? Compliance, or the removal of systems that refuse it. Vaggy's grip on her spear tightened. That sounds like a threat. It's a statement of intent. He moved toward the lobby doors with the unhurried pace of someone who knew no one would stop him. I'll be investigating the source of the alteration. If your extermination exists by legitimate agreement, I'll observe it. If not, Lucifer Hazbin's voice had an edge now. The stranger paused at the threshold. Then I'll correct it. He left without another word, the doors closing behind him, with a soft click that somehow felt louder than any dramatic exit could have been. The lobby remained frozen for 3 full seconds. Then Lucifer Hazbin exploded. What the fuck was that? Language, Charlie said automatically. Charlie, there was another me. A weird, cryptic, possibly omniscient other me, who just casually strolled into your hotel and... He gestured wildly. And what audited my life choices? Alastor's laughter returned rich and delighted. I like him. Of course you do, Vaggie muttered. Charlie sank into one of the lobby chairs, her mind racing. 2 versions of her father. One who ruled hell because he'd fallen, and one who apparently existed outside the rules entirely. One who just had his entire identity questioned in the span of 30 seconds. Dad, she said carefully, that thing he asked about choosing your role. Did you? Lucifer Hazbin didn't answer. He stared at the closed doors, his expression unreadable. Upstairs in a room that had definitely been empty 5 minutes ago, the stranger stood by a window overlooking Pentagram City. He'd told the truth, as he always did. He was here because of an unauthorized edit, a change to cosmic law that had rippled through enough adjacent frameworks to catch his attention. But he'd omitted one detail. The edit hadn't surprised him. He'd been watching for it. For alterations like this. For systems that governed through violence and called it order. For hierarchies that denied choice and called it justice. Heaven's extermination protocol was exactly the kind of machinery he'd spent an eternity dismantling. And now he'd found it operating in a world that shared his name. Below, Charlie Morningstar tried to convince her father that the hotel was still worth believing in. Tried to salvage the visit she'd been hoping for since she'd made the phone call. But Lucifer Hazbin wasn't listening. He was thinking about choices, about roles, about whether he'd ever actually decided to be the king of hell. Or if he'd simply accepted it, because rejection would have required admitting he had the power to choose otherwise. The question gnawed at him, and in a room upstairs, the stranger who'd asked it smiled faintly. Questions were how you broke foundations, and this foundation was long overdue for examination. Guys, I have to say, this chapter was so awkward, but in a really funny way. When the stranger asks whether Lucifer actually chose to be king, or just followed a script that hit way harder than I expected, it makes you wonder if we are actually in control of our lives, or if we are just doing what we are told. If you met a smarter version of yourself today, would you be scared or excited? Let me know in the comments below. Carmilla Carmine's workshop occupied the kind of real estate that only existed in Hell's industrial district. Steel beams, concrete floors, the smell of metal and something else, something that didn't belong in any foundry, because it came from beings who weren't supposed to bleed. The weapons dealer stood behind a titanium workbench, examining a blade with the clinical detachment of a surgeon studying an X-ray. Gothic elegance wrapped in industrial efficiency. She didn't look up when her visitor entered. I don't take walk-ins, she said. I'm not walking in. I'm following a supply chain. The stranger moved through the space like he was cataloging inventory. You scavenge angelic weapons after each extermination, reverse engineer them, sell the results to anyone with sufficient funds. Carmilla's eyes narrowed. And you know this, how? Because your operation is thorough enough to leave evidence. He stopped in front of a display case containing fragments, broken spear tips, shattered blade edges, pieces of weaponry that had survived contact with sinners and exorcists alike. I need one of those. They're not for sale to tourists. I'm not a tourist. I'm conducting an audit. Something in his tone made Carmilla set down her current project. She studied him properly now. Dark suit, no weapons visible, no nervousness. The kind of calm that suggested either stupidity or absolute confidence in his ability to survive whatever happened next. An audit? She repeated. Of what? Compliance, authorization, the legitimacy of systems that operate through scheduled violence. He gestured to the fragments. These weapons kill permanently. Sinners, demons, according to recent discoveries, angels themselves. Carmilla's expression didn't change, but her posture shifted fractionally. That information isn't public. It is now. One of your daughters used angelic steel against an exorcist during a skirmish. The body didn't regenerate. He paused. Heaven knows. They simply haven't acknowledged it yet, because acknowledgement would require explaining why weapons meant to enforce divine order can be turned against its enforcers. The silence stretched. Carmilla moved to a locked cabinet, retrieved a small case, and placed it on the workbench between them. Inside lay a fragment no larger than a finger. It gleamed with that particular quality of light that had nothing to do with hell's ambient illumination. 10,000 souls, she said. That's remarkably cheap for proof of heaven's incompetence. Her smile was sharp. I didn't say I was selling proof. I'm selling metal. He opened the case, examined the fragment without touching it, then closed it again. This will suffice. Payment first. I don't trade in souls. He reached into his jacket and withdrew something that made Carmilla's breath catch. A coin. Not hellish currency. Not anything that should exist in this cosmology. It radiated with the kind of fundamental wrongness that suggested it had been minted in a framework where different rules applied. Where did you get that? I made it, just now. He set it on the workbench. It contains value equivalent to your asking price. I suggest you don't try to spend it anywhere that enforces standard economic principles. Carmilla stared at the coin, then at him. Who are you? Someone who believes contracts should be honored, and schedules should be authorized. He took the case. Heaven changed the extermination timeline without consultation. That makes this entire mechanism questionable. And this, he lifted the fragment, proves the mechanism was flawed from inception. He turned to leave, then paused. You've built an empire on the corpses of beings who claim divine authority. I won't insult you by pretending that's noble, but I will acknowledge it's efficient. That's not a compliment. No, it's an observation. The door closed behind him with the same understated finality he seemed to bring to every exit. Carmilla stood alone in her workshop holding a coin that shouldn't exist, wondering what kind of entity casually created currency to purchase evidence against heaven. Across the city, Charlie Morningstar sat in the hotel library, surrounded by books about redemption, reformation, and the theological logistics of saving souls who'd already been condemned. Vaggie had gone to check the perimeter defenses. Angel Dust was doing whatever Angel Dust did when no one was supervising. Alistair was probably watching everything from some impossible vantage point. The stranger who called himself Lucifer walked in carrying a small case. Charlie looked up. Did you just come back, or have you been here the whole time? Both depending on how you measure continuity. He set the case on the reading table. I need to show you something. If this is another existential question about my dad's life choices, it's about yours. He opened the case. The fragment gleamed in the library's dim light. Charlie recognized it immediately. Everyone in hell knew what angelic steel looked like. It was the material that made extermination permanent. The substance that turned divine judgment into irreversible execution. Why are you showing me this? Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. Because you're trying to prove sinners deserve redemption. But your entire argument exists under the shadow of scheduled termination. You're negotiating for mercy from a system that executes on a calendar. He gestured to the fragment. This proves the system isn't divine judgment. It's logistics, crowd control, population management dressed in theological language. Charlie pushed the case away. I know heaven isn't perfect. I know the extermination is brutal. But that doesn't mean redemption isn't real. It doesn't mean we should stop trying to... I'm not telling you to stop. His tone softened fractionally. I'm asking you to consider what redemption means, when the alternative is annihilation enforced by a timetable. If you need weapons to prove you deserve to exist, someone else has already decided you don't. Then what am I supposed to do? Just let them kill everyone? No. Question who gave them permission to make that the choice in the first place. He closed the case, leaving it on the table. The extermination happens in 4 weeks. When it does, I'll be examining whether heaven's authority to conduct it was ever legitimate. If it was, I'll observe. If it wasn't, you'll fight an army of angels. I'll correct a procedural error. Charlie stared at him. At this being who wore her father's name like an ill-fitting costume, who spoke about cosmic law, the way Carmilla spoke about weapons shipments, who just spent a fortune on a piece of metal to prove a point about bureaucratic illegitimacy. You're not trying to save anyone, are you? No. Then why are you here? Because systems that kill on schedules offend me. Because authority that can't justify itself deserves to be questioned. Because someone edited a cosmic contract without authorization, and I've made it my business to audit such things. He moved toward the door. Your redemption project is admirable. Naive, perhaps, but admirable. I hope you succeed. You don't sound like you think we will. Success and failure aren't my concern. Choice is. The freedom to attempt something impossible is worth more than guaranteed outcomes in a scripted universe. He left the library as smoothly as he'd entered it. Charlie sat alone with the case containing proof that angels could die, proof that heaven's weapons could be turned against heaven's soldiers, proof that the entire extermination mechanism was built on a foundation of assumed invulnerability that had already cracked. She didn't open it again. Upstairs, Lucifer Hazbin stood on the hotel's roof looking out over Pentagram City. The countdown continued. 4 weeks until the portal opened. 4 weeks until the extermination that came 6 months too early because someone Adam probably had decided hell needed cleaning faster than the original schedule allowed. He'd been king of hell for millennia. He'd built this place, organized it, turned it from chaos into structured damnation with rules and hierarchies and systems that, however brutal, at least made sense. And now, there was someone else wearing his name, who looked at all of it, at heaven, at hell, at the carefully negotiated treaties between them, and saw nothing but unauthorized edits to a contract no one had properly signed. The question still gnawed at him. Do you rule because you chose to? He'd told himself for centuries that he'd chosen exile. Chosen pride over obedience, chosen to make his own kingdom rather than serve in someone else's. But building hell had meant negotiating with heaven, accepting the extermination as the price of autonomy, agreeing to purges in exchange for being left alone between them. When exactly had choice become compromise? When had compromise become script? Footsteps on the roof behind him. He didn't turn around. Go away, Elaster, not Elastor. His daughter's voice, small, uncertain. Dad, I need to ask you something. He finally turned. Charlie stood there holding a case that gleamed faintly in hell's perpetual twilight. That stranger, she said. The one who claims to be you. He bought this. He says it proves heaven's authority was never legitimate. She opened the case, showing the angelic steel fragment. Was he right? Is the extermination just population control? Is there any divine justice to it at all? Lucifer Hazbin looked at the fragment, at the proof that angels could be killed by the same weapons they'd wielded against demons for millennia. I don't know, he admitted. I stopped asking whether it was just a long time ago. I just tried to make sure we survived it. That's not the same as choosing. No, it's not. Charlie closed the case. He scares me. Not because he's powerful. Because he makes everything sound like it was optional. Like we've all been following scripts we could have rejected. Maybe we have been. The words surprised him as much as they surprised her. They stood together on the roof, father and daughter, watching hell prepare for another round of scheduled annihilation. Somewhere in the city, an auditor who shouldn't exist walked through streets that didn't belong to him, carrying evidence that the machinery of judgment had always been flawed. 4 weeks until the extermination. 4 weeks until someone tested whether divine authority required permission. The countdown continued, but for the first time in a very long time. Lucifer Morningstar, the king of hell, not the stranger, wondered if the timer itself had ever been legitimate, or if everyone had simply stopped questioning it. The countdown reached 0 at noon. Hell didn't have sunlight, but everyone felt the moment arrive anyway. A pressure change in the atmosphere, a collective holding a breath across Pentagram City. The annual reminder that existence in hell came with an expiration date subject to review by beings who'd never had to justify their authority. Except this year, the review came 6 months early. The sky split, not metaphorically, not gradually. One moment there was hell's usual red haze, the next a vertical slash of pure white light carved across the horizon, like someone had decided the firmament needed emergency surgery. The portal hummed with a frequency that made sinners clutch their heads and demons reach for weapons they knew wouldn't help. Through the opening, figures descended. At the head of the formation, Adam grinned behind his mask. "Let's fucking go!" His voice boomed across the battlefield. 6 months early means we get to kill twice as many overachievement bitches. At the Hazbin Hotel, Charlie stood on the front steps, watching the apocalypse arrive on schedule. "We'll still be dead if you get yourself killed standing here." Vaggie dragged her through the doors as the first exorcist swooped overhead, close enough that the wind from her wings shattered windows. "I'm going to examine that portal," he said. Exorcists, dozens of them, hundreds. White armor, gleaming wings spread, angelic weapons drawn and ready. They fell toward Pentagram City in formations that spoke of practice routine, the kind of precision that came from doing this exact same thing once a year for millennia. The first wave hit the streets like a meteor shower, designed by someone with a vendetta against zoning laws. Buildings exploded, sinners scattered. The ones too slow or too stubborn to run simply ceased to exist, their forms dissolving under angelic blades, with a finality that made every other death in hell look temporary by comparison. Vaggie pulled her back toward the entrance. "We need to get inside. Now! They're dying." Charlie's voice came out hollow. "All of them. Everyone we haven't reached yet. Everyone who didn't get a chance." Inside the lobby, organized chaos reigned. Angel Dust was barricading windows with furniture. Husk had retreated behind the bar with a bottle, an expression that suggested he'd seen this particular show before and knew how it ended. Nifty darted between rooms with manic energy as though cleaning faster would somehow protect them from divine judgment. Alastair stood at the center of it all, unnaturally still. His smile fixed, but his eyes tracking movement outside with predatory focus. "How long can you hold them?" Charlie asked. "Long enough." He raised one hand and the air around the hotel shimmered. A barrier materialized, not solid, not visible except as a faint distortion, stretching in a dome over the entire building. "They'll have to work for their righteousness today." The first exorcist to test the barrier bounced off it with enough force to send her tumbling. 3 more followed. Then a dozen. They swarmed the shield like wasps against glass weapons, scraping and sparking, but not penetrating. Adam's voice cut through the chaos. "What the fuck is this?" He descended toward the hotel, flanked by loot and a cadre of elite exorcists. His weapon, a guitar that somehow functioned as both instrument and axe, crackled with holy energy. Some kind of demon bullshit barrier. Loot assessed it with clinical precision. "We can break through given time." "Time?" Adam laughed. "We've got 6 months worth of killing to catch up on. Break it now." They struck in unison. The barrier held, but strain showed in Alastor's posture. His grin remained fixed, but sweat beaded on his forehead. Maintaining a shield against this level of assault required concentration that even the radio demand found taxing. "They're persistent," he observed, voice tight. "Can you hold—" Vaggie gripped her spear, knowing it was useless against what stood outside. "Can and will are different questions, my dear." Across the city, the extermination continued its methodical work. V-Tower's neon displays went dark as Vox redirected all power to defensive systems. Carmilla's warehouses became fortresses. Angelic steel turned against its makers with limited success. Demons wielding heaven's weapons could wound angels. But wounding wasn't enough against sheer numbers and aerial superiority. The V's held their territory through coordination and technological advantage. Lesser overlords fell or fled. Common sinners died in numbers that would have been called genocide if the perpetrators weren't operating under divine mandate. On a rooftop overlooking the carnage, Lucifer Morningstar, king of hell, architect of its bureaucracy, father, currently failing to protect his daughter, stood paralyzed by treaty obligations he'd negotiated centuries ago. He could fight. His power dwarfed every exorcist in the sky combined. He could close the portal, banish the angels, rewrite the fundamental rules of engagement between heaven and hell. But doing so would violate the agreement, would trigger full-scale war, would force heaven to either escalate or admit their authority was negotiable. And heaven never admitted anything, so he watched, hands clenched, power burning just beneath his skin, watching his subjects die because stopping it meant breaking laws he'd helped write. "You're going to let them all die." Lucifer spun. The stranger, the other him, the one from elsewhere, stood at the rooftop's edge, observing the massacre with clinical detachment. "I can't just— there are rules." "Yes, I'm aware." The stranger's gaze tracked an exorcist cutting through a group of fleeing imps. "I've been reading them. The treaties, the compromises, the carefully worded agreements that let heaven kill on schedule in exchange for hell's autonomy between purges." He turned. "Tell me, did you negotiate those terms, or did you simply accept the best offer from beings who'd already decided what you were allowed to have?" "That's not—" Lucifer's voice cracked. "I built this place. I organized it. Made it livable. The extermination was the price. And you call that choosing?" It wasn't a question. Below, an exorcist's blade found its mark. A sinner dissolved screaming. Another. 10 more. The efficiency was remarkable. The brutality was sanctioned. The injustice was legal. "What would you have me do?" Lucifer demanded. "Break the treaty? Start a war that would consume both realms? I would have you question who granted them the authority to make that the choice." The stranger gestured to the portal, still pouring soldiers into hell's airspace. "That mechanism operates on assumptions. Heaven's right to judge. Hell's obligation to accept judgment. The legitimacy of violence enforced by schedule rather than verdict. Those assumptions kept us from total annihilation. No, those assumptions kept you compliant. At the hotel, the barrier cracked, not broke, cracked. A hairline fracture that Adam immediately exploited, driving his weapon through the gap like a wedge splitting stone. The shield shattered in cascading fragments of dissipating energy. Alastair staggered, radio static erupting from him in discordant bursts. "Well, that's unfortunate." Exorcists poured through the breach. Charlie threw herself in front of the first one, demonic form manifesting in desperation. Horns spiraled from her head. Her eyes blazed. Power she rarely used because it reminded her too much of what she was trying to redeem flared around her. She caught the exorcist's blade barehanded. It cut through her palm like paper. Angelic steel didn't care about demonic royalty. It killed what it touched permanently, with the kind of theological finality that made death in hell's usual ecosystem look reversible. Vaggie tackled the exorcist from the side, her own angelic steel fragment salvaged, repurposed, turned against its makers, finding a gap in armor. The angel fell. Didn't dissolve. Angels could be killed. Carmilla had proven that. But one dead angel meant nothing against a sky full of them. Adam stepped through the shattered barrier's remains, his weapon resting casually on his shoulder. "Nice place you've got here, princess. Be a shame if someone—" He swung. The guitar axe carved through the hotel's front wall like it was made of paper. Oh, wait. Too late. Charlie moved to intercept him. Vaggie was already in motion. Angel Dust grabbed a salvaged angelic spear and charged with the kind of reckless courage that usually preceded messy deaths. And on the rooftop, the stranger who called himself Lucifer made a decision. Hell's King stared at him. "What?" "The mechanism by which heaven accesses your domain. I need to verify its operational parameters before determining whether its continued function is authorized." He moved toward the edge of the roof. "I suggest you protect your daughter. I'll be occupied for the next several minutes." "You can't just—" But the stranger was already gone. Not flying, not teleporting. Simply no longer present, as though he'd decided his location was a variable he could adjust without consulting the underlying physics. Lucifer stood alone on the rooftop, torn between treaty obligations and paternal instinct, watching his daughter fight for a hotel full of sinners against angels operating under divine mandate. He made his choice. Golden light exploded from him as he dove toward the battle. Treaty be damned. War be damned. If heaven wanted to accelerate the schedule, they could explain it to him personally. At the portal itself, hanging in the sky above Pentagram City's ruins, the stranger examined the structure with the focus of an engineer finding faults in a blueprint. One-way passage from heaven to hell. Temporal anchors set to annual intervals recently modified to 6 months without bilateral authorization. Energy signatures suggesting construction from the same fundamental forces that governed both realms' existence. And underneath it all, a permission structure that assumed heaven's right to open such passages whenever they determined population control was necessary. No trial, no appeal, no individual judgment of the beings being killed. Just a schedule and a door, and angels who'd been told this was maintenance. He reached out, touching the portal's edge with one finger. The structure recognized him as Lucifer Morningstar. The name registered across multiple frameworks, but couldn't reconcile which version's permissions applied. Hell's King had no authority to close this passage, but this Lucifer existed outside the treaty's jurisdiction entirely. The portal flickered, just once, just for a moment, but long enough for every exorcist currently in hell to notice heaven's door had experienced something it had never experienced before. Uncertainty. Below, the battle continued. Charlie bled. Vaggie fought. Lucifer Hazbin arrived, trailing golden fire and paternal rage. Adam laughed because this was the most entertainment he'd had in decades. And at the portal's edge, the auditor finished his examination and smiled. The system had activated. Protocol had executed according to its programming. Heaven had demonstrated exactly how little authorization it needed to conduct mass killing. The evidence was sufficient. Now came the correction. The second wave was preparing to deploy when the portal stopped functioning correctly. Not closed, not destroyed. It remained open, a vertical slash of white light connecting heaven to hell's airspace. But something in its fundamental operation had changed. The coordinates, the destination vector, the assumption that passage through it led anywhere heaven had authorized. At the portal's edge, still suspended in the air above Pentagram City's burning districts, the stranger held the angelic steel fragment between two fingers like a key that had finally found its lock. "Interesting design," he said to no one in particular. One-way passage enforced through theological assumption rather than mechanical limitation. Heaven's authority to access hell encoded as self-evident truth rather than negotiated permission. The fragment gleamed, not with power, with proof. He inserted it into the portal's structure. Not physically, the gesture was symbolic, a representation of logical override. The steel existed as evidence of heaven's own contradiction. Weapons capable of permanent termination issued by a system claiming divine justice, deployed on schedules rather than verdicts. The protocol's foundation cracked, not explosively, not dramatically. The way legal precedent shifts when someone introduces evidence that the law was written by parties who'd never had standing in the first place. Inside Heaven's staging area, Loot was organizing the second deployment when the portal's readout flickered. Destination coordinates scrambled. Passage integrity maintained, but endpoint uncertain. "Sir." She turned to Adam, who was still basking in the glory of the first wave's efficiency. "We have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The kind where I don't know where the next wave is going to land." Adam's grin faltered. "What do you mean you don't know? It's the same portal we've been using for..." "Someone's changing the destination parameters." Loot's fingers flew across controls that had never required adjustment before. "The passage is stable, but it's not pointing at hell anymore." "Then where?" The second wave deployed before Adam could finish his question. 200 exorcists dropped through the portal in perfect formation, weapons ready, wings spread, prepared for the same routine slaughter they'd been conducting for millennia. They emerged into white, not hell, not anywhere. A space that was featureless in the way that suggested it had been designed specifically to contain nothing of consequence. No ground, no sky, no targets. Just endless emptiness that extended in directions that made three-dimensional thinking feel inadequate. The exorcists hung there suspended, confused, unable to proceed with their mandate because there was nothing to execute it against. Back in hell, the hotel's ruins still smoldered. Charlie sat among the wreckage hands, pressed against a wound that was healing too slowly because angelic steel didn't care about demonic regeneration. Vaggie knelt beside her, applying pressure, cursing in Spanish and English simultaneously. Lucifer Hazbin paced nearby, golden fire still crackling around him from the fight he'd been engaged in before the second wave simply didn't arrive. Where are they? He scanned the sky. The portal remained open. Heaven's door still gaped, but no angels descended. The portal's active. They should be elsewhere. The stranger descended from the portal's vicinity, landing on the hotel's shattered front steps with the casual precision of someone adjusting their location rather than traveling. I redirected subsequent waves to a holding space. They're unharmed, simply no longer able to participate in scheduled killing. Silence. Adam's voice exploded from somewhere beyond the portal, magically amplified through sheer force of outrage. "What the fuck did you just do?" "Corrected a procedural error." The stranger brushed non-existent dust from his sleeve. "Your extermination protocol operates on an authorization structure that assumes Heaven's unilateral right to conduct population control in hell. That assumption is contradicted by your own enforcement mechanisms." He held up the angelic steel fragment. "These weapons kill permanently. You issued them. Your soldiers used them. One of your own exorcists died to a blade you provided, proving the tools themselves acknowledge no inherent divine immunity. If Heaven's judgment were truly absolute, your weapons wouldn't function against Heaven's agents." Adam materialized at the portal's edge, mask cracked from the earlier battle fury, radiating from him in waves. "You don't have the authority to." "I don't require authority. I'm simply noting that you lack it." The stranger's tone remained level. The original treaty between heaven and hell specified annual intervals. You modified it to 6 months without bilateral agreement. That makes this entire operation a violation of your own governance structures. Lucifer agreed to. He agreed to terms you altered unilaterally. The stranger gestured toward Hell's king, who stood frozen, caught between vindication and the uncomfortable realization that someone had just defended his sovereignty without asking permission. Did you consult him before shortening the timeline? Did you seek authorization before accelerating a schedule that both parties had accepted as binding? Adam's jaw worked. No sound came out. "That's what I thought." The stranger turned his attention to the portal itself. "This mechanism will remain open. Heaven maintains its architectural presence. but the destination has been modified to prevent unauthorized access to Hell's domain, pending proper renegotiation of terms. Lut appeared beside Adam, her expression calculating. "You're holding our soldiers hostage." "No. I've placed them in a waiting area while governance structures catch up to operational reality. When Heaven demonstrates legitimate authority to conduct extermination, proper authorization, bilateral agreement, something beyond, we decided you're overpopulated, I'll restore passage." He paused. "Until then, they're in a space where they can contemplate whether following orders constitutes sufficient moral justification." "This is an act of war," Adam snarled. "No. This is an audit finding noncompliance." The stranger's expression didn't change. "War would imply I recognized Heaven's authority to declare it. I don't. You're a bureaucracy enforcing violence on a schedule, nothing more." The portal flickered, not closing, just waiting. A door that led somewhere other than where Heaven intended. Adam screamed something obscene and vanished back through the passage, presumably to rally forces or file complaints with higher authorities. Lut remained studying the stranger with the focus of someone trying to identify a threat category she'd never encountered before. "What are you?" she asked quietly. "Someone who believes treaties should be honored, and permissions should be granted, not assumed." She vanished after Adam leaving Hell in sudden disorienting silence. The extermination had stopped. Not through victory, not through negotiation, through the simple act of someone removing Heaven's ability to access the battlefield while maintaining their procedural right to maintain the door. Charlie struggled to her feet, leaning on Vaggie. "You saved them." "No." The stranger's correction was gentle but firm. "I prevented further killing. That's not salvation. That's removing an illegitimate threat. Your redemption project remains necessary because Hell's population still consists of beings who made choices that led them here. I haven't absolved anyone. I've simply stopped them from being executed on an arbitrary calendar." Lucifer Hazbin found his voice. "You rewrote the portal's destination, just changed where Heaven's door leads. That's..." He struggled for words. "That's reality-level manipulation. That's not fighting. That's editing." "Yes, and you did it because Heaven violated treaty terms." "Partially. I did it because the treaty itself was negotiated between parties, where one held overwhelming force and the other had no choice but to accept terms. That's coercion, not agreement." The stranger looked at Hell's king directly. "You built a bureaucracy to manage damnation. Heaven built one to periodically cull it. Neither of you ever asked whether the entire structure was legitimate in the first place." "So what now?" Charlie asked. "Heaven's going to demand their soldiers back. They're going to demand justification." The stranger moved toward the hotel's remains. "They'll have to explain why they believe they have the right to conduct scheduled termination. They'll have to defend the protocol rather than simply execute it. And when they can't, because violence on a calendar can't be defended, only enforced, then we'll discuss what comes next." Alistair emerged from the wreckage, his smile intact. But something in his eyes suggested he was reassessing every assumption he'd made about power dynamics in the afterlife. "You're not staying, are you?" he asked. "I have no interest in ruling Hell or Heaven." The stranger paused at what had once been the hotel's entrance. "I'm here to correct an unauthorized edit. Once Heaven acknowledges it lacks legitimate authority for this protocol, I'll move on. And if they don't acknowledge it," Vaggie's grip on her spear tightened, "then I'll continue preventing access until they do. I have nothing but time. Heaven has a bureaucracy to maintain soldiers in a white room to explain and a treaty violation to justify. The machinery has stopped. Whether the ideology follows is their choice." He walked into the ruined hotel, leaving Hell's defenders standing among the wreckage of what should have been their annihilation. Across the city, sinners emerged from hiding. Overlords assessed damage. Carmilla Carmine received reports that the extermination had simply ended. Not with victory, not with defeat, with cessation. Vox's screens tried to make sense of it for his audience. 200 exorcists missing. Portals still open, but non-functional. Heaven's response pending. Hell's response uncertain. And in a white space beyond normal cosmological boundaries, 200 warriors waited in formation, unable to complete their mission, unable to return home, suspended in the realization that someone had removed their purpose without destroying their existence. It was several of them realized with growing discomfort, remarkably similar to what they'd done to sinners for millennia. Remove agency, remove choice, remove purpose. Call it judgment. The difference was that sinners went to hell. These soldiers were simply removed from the equation entirely. Back at the hotel, Lucifer Hazbin sat among the ruins his daughter had built, watching the stranger, his impossible doppelganger, examine the damage with clinical interest. "You didn't do this for us," Lucifer said quietly. "No, you don't even care if hell survives. I care whether hell has the right to exist without scheduled intervention from beings who assume authority they can't justify." The stranger glanced at him. "Your survival is your concern. The removal of illegitimate machinery is mine." That's cold. Yes. No apology, no regret. But it's honest. I won't pretend to care about your kingdom. I simply refuse to tolerate systems that kill on schedules and call it divine order. Charlie approached slowly, her wound still healing. "What happens when heaven refuses, when they demand their soldiers back and reinstate the protocol?" The stranger looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Then I'll explain to them that authority requires consent. And if they continue to refuse that basic principle, I'll ensure their machinery never functions in this framework again." He smiled faintly. "Questions are how you break foundations. I've already asked the question. Now we wait to see if heaven can answer it." The portal hung in the sky, open, empty, waiting. And for the first time in millennia, hell didn't count down to its next scheduled death. The machinery had stopped. The audit was just beginning. Okay, this was hands down the best moment ever. Because Adam was ready for a big war, and the stranger just turned off the internet router on him. He did not even fight, he just used some admin magic to send the bad guys to a boring white room for a timeout. It is hilarious watching Adam lose his mind because he cannot punch his way out of a computer error and he just looked so helpless. Honestly, being smart is way more dangerous than having big weapons. If it were you, what would you do if you were Adam in that situation? The space that manifested wasn't heaven. Wasn't hell either. It existed in the gap between frameworks, conjured by someone who apparently didn't need permission to designate neutral ground. It looked like a jazz club designed by someone who'd read about justice, but never particularly cared for it. Low lighting, brass fixtures, a stage at one end. Tables arranged in a semicircle facing it. The kind of venue where difficult conversations happened over drinks that no one actually enjoyed. Adam materialized first, flanked by loot, and a dozen exorcists whose weapons remained drawn, despite the obvious futility. He scanned the space with undisguised hostility. "What the fuck is this?" "A hearing." The stranger stood at the stage's edge, hands clasped behind his back. No podium, no notes. Just a being who decided heaven needed to explain itself in front of witnesses. "You demanded return of your soldiers. I'm willing to discuss terms. But first, you'll justify the operation they were conducting." "Justify? Adam's laugh was ugly. "We don't justify shit to you. No, you'll justify it to them." He gestured. The tables filled. Not with angels. Not with demons who'd survived exterminations through luck or power. With the ones who hadn't. With sinners pulled from moments before their permanent deaths, given form long enough to witness this conversation. Translucent. Temporary. But present. Charlie appeared at one of the tables vaggy beside her. Lucifer Hazbin materialized reluctantly, looking like he'd been summoned to a family intervention he desperately wanted to avoid. Alastair claimed a corner seat, already enthralled. "You can't compel us to," Lute began. "I'm not compelling anything. I'm offering a platform." The stranger's tone remained level. "Explain why the extermination is legitimate. Convince them. Convince her." He nodded toward Charlie. "Convince anyone in this room that scheduled mass termination serves a purpose beyond population control through violence." "It's not about convincing," Adam snarled. "It's about maintaining order. Hell gets overcrowded. Hell gets dangerous. We trim the numbers. Simple fucking logistics." "Logistics." The stranger let the word hang. "Not judgment. Not divine will. Logistics." "Yeah, so what?" "So you're admitting this isn't justice. It's resource management." Adam's jaw worked. "It's maintaining the balance between..." "Between what?" The question came sharp. "Heaven's comfort and hell's existence. Because that's what logistics means. You're not saving anyone. You're preventing inconvenience." Lute stepped forward, her composure more intact than Adam's. "Hell's population represents a threat. If allowed to grow unchecked, the sheer concentration of malevolent will could destabilize both realms. The extermination prevents that outcome. By killing indiscriminately, by maintaining necessary population thresholds, without trial, without individual assessment, without determining whether any specific soul poses the threat you claim." The stranger's gaze didn't waver. "You execute based on location, not action. They're in hell," Adam said flatly. "That's the action. They chose sin. They chose damnation. We're just making sure damnation doesn't overflow." One of the translucent sinners, a woman who died in the last extermination, spoke up, voice barely above a whisper. "I stole bread to feed my daughter. That's why I went to hell. Theft. Is that enough to justify?" "Yes." Adam didn't hesitate. "You sinned. You fell. The rest is just crying about consequences." Charlie stood abruptly. "She died protecting her child. How is that irrelevant?" Lute's interruption was clinical. The criteria for damnation were established long before any current soul arrived. We don't reassess, we enforce. Even if circumstances change. Charlie's hands gripped the table edge. Even if they want to change. Even if redemption is possible. Redemption is heaven's decision to grant, not hell's to demand. Adam leaned against the stage, clearly enjoying this. "You want to save sinners? Great. Prove it works. Until then, we're preventing uprising by keeping numbers manageable." "Manageable?" The stranger repeated the word like he was tasting poison. "Define the threshold. How many souls constitute a threat versus how many are acceptable losses?" Silence. "You don't have a number," the stranger observed. "You have a schedule. Annual intervals recently shortened to 6 months. The quantity killed depends on how many you encounter, not how many constitute actual danger." "We kill until the risk is mitigated," Lute said. "And who determines when risk is mitigated?" "We do." "Based on what metric?" Another pause. "Based on our assessment of hell's current threat level," Lute said carefully. "Which you measure how?" "Operationally classified information." Translation, you don't measure it. You simply decide hell has too many souls and reduce the number until you're satisfied. The stranger's expression didn't change. That's not risk management. That's periodic culling justified by assumptions you refuse to verify. Adam's patience snapped. "Look, you sanctimonious prick. Hell is full of murderers, rapists, thieves, and every other kind of scum that couldn't follow basic fucking rules. We give them eternity to suffer for their choices. The extermination just makes sure they don't suffer so densely that they organize and attack heaven. It's practical, it's necessary, and it's authorized by whom?" The stranger's interruption was surgical. "Who authorized the original protocol?" "God," Adam said flatly. "Present him." The words dropped like stones. Adam stared. What? Present the authorizing party. Show me the document. The decree. The direct instruction from a verifiable source that grants heaven unilateral right to conduct scheduled termination in hell without hell's sovereign consent. Lucifer agreed to, under duress, after losing a war, with no leverage except the promise that compliance would buy hell autonomy between purges. The stranger glanced at Lucifer Hazbin. Correct. Hell's king didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet. We agreed because it bought us time. The admission hung in the air like a confession. So not consent, capitulation. The stranger returned his attention to Adam. You're enforcing an agreement made between victor and defeated, calling it divine mandate and executing it on a schedule that one party just unilaterally modified without consulting the other. Hell doesn't get a vote, Adam said. They lost. They take what they get. Then admit it's punishment, not protection. Fine, it's punishment. They sinned, they fell. They get purged periodically because that's what happens when you reject heaven. Adam's voice rose. You want us to feel bad about killing sinners? Fuck that. They made their choices. We're making ours. Charlie's voice cut through the declaration. And what about the ones who didn't choose? The ones who ended up in hell because they were born in the wrong place, believed the wrong things, loved the wrong people. They had lifetimes to correct course, Lute said. No. They had lifetimes under systems that damned them for circumstances they couldn't control. Charlie stepped forward. You're not protecting anyone. You're maintaining a cycle where damnation is permanent and improvement is punished with death. Improvement. Adam laughed. You think running a hotel makes up for murder, for rape, for the shit these people did that landed them here? I think people deserve the chance to try. Charlie's voice shook, but held. I think a system that kills on calendars isn't justice. It's just efficient cruelty. Call it what you want, princess. Doesn't change the fact that hell is a threat, and we're managing it. The stranger spoke again, quieter now. If this is threat management, why do the weapons you issued kill angels? The room stilled. The angelic steel you distributed. He continued producing the fragment he'd acquired from Carmilla's workshop. It terminates permanently. No distinction between demon and angel. If your authority were truly absolute, your tools wouldn't acknowledge equality of vulnerability. Lute's expression tightened. That's a manufacturing flaw. An oversight that's existed for millennia, or evidence that the weapons recognize no inherent divine immunity. He set the fragment on the nearest table. You built instruments of permanent death and claimed only demons would fall to them. But Carmilla Carmine killed an exorcist with your own blade. Heaven's soldier, ended by heaven's weapon. One death doesn't. It proves the system is mortal, fallible, operating on assumption rather than absolute authority. The stranger's gaze swept the assembled witnesses. Heaven claims the right to kill based on divine mandate. But the tools of that mandate acknowledge no divine protection. The logic contradicts itself. Adam slammed his fist on the stage. Enough philosophy bullshit. You want us to admit we kill sinners, fine. We do. We will continue doing so until hell stops being a threat. That's the deal. That's reality. And if you don't like it, you can what? The stranger's interruption was soft. Declare war on someone outside your jurisdiction. Escalate against an entity you don't have authority to compel. The implications settled. Adam had no leverage. Heaven had no mechanism to force compliance from someone who didn't recognize their authority in the first place. The entire apparatus depended on everyone agreeing that heaven's power was legitimate, and this being simply didn't. Return our soldiers, Lute said, shifting to the only concrete demand she could make. When you provide legitimate authorization for the operation they were conducting, we don't answer to you. No, you answer to the question I'm asking. By what right do you kill? The stranger's expression remained neutral. I'm not judging the morality. I'm examining the procedure. Show me the authorization. Show me the bilateral agreement. Show me anything that proves this isn't simply Victor's privilege wrapped in theological language. Silence stretched. Adam's rage simmered. Lute's calculation showed in the set of her jaw. The translucent sinners watched with the hollow attention of beings who'd already died to this system once. We're done here. Adam turned toward the exit that hadn't existed a moment ago. Keep the soldiers. Keep your self-righteous audit. When you're ready to return to reality, we'll be waiting. He vanished through the doorway. Lute and the exorcists followed. The space began to dissolve. Its purpose served. Charlie remained standing, hands still gripping the table. Did we win? No. The stranger's answer was immediate. No one won. Heaven refused to justify itself, but also refused to concede. The machinery remains stopped, but the ideology persists. Then what was the point? The point was making them state their reasoning aloud, forcing them to defend "we kill because we can" in front of the people they kill. He glanced at the fading sinners. Some battles aren't won with victory. They're won when the victor can no longer pretend their violence is virtuous. The last translucent figure dissolved. The jazz club faded. Reality reasserted itself, or what passed for reality, in the space between heaven and hell. Lucifer Hazbin stood alone in what had been the hearing room, staring at where Adam had stood. For millennia, he'd accepted the extermination as the price of autonomy. Negotiated it, managed it, survived it. He'd never once demanded heaven justify it, and now someone had forced them to admit that "we kill because we're stronger" was the foundation of the entire apparatus. The stranger appeared beside him. Not walking, just present. You could have stopped this centuries ago, Lucifer said quietly. No, you could have questioned it centuries ago. I wasn't here. The stranger's tone held no judgment. But you are, and you have power, and you chose compliance over confrontation because confrontation risked everything you'd built. And now heaven knows someone exists who doesn't recognize their authority, who won't negotiate, who simply removes their ability to act until they demonstrate legitimate cause. He turned toward the exit. What you do with that knowledge is your choice. He left Lucifer standing in the dissolving space, surrounded by the echoes of arguments. Heaven couldn't win and wouldn't surrender. Charlie found Vaggie in the ruins of the hotel, still processing what they'd witnessed. He didn't save us, Charlie said. He just made them admit they were killing us for convenience. Is that better or worse? Vaggie asked. I don't know. Charlie looked at the sky where the portal still hung inactive but present. They can't use it, but they also won't acknowledge they shouldn't. We're just stuck, waiting to see who breaks first. Heaven won't break, Vaggie said with certainty. No. Charlie's voice was small. They won't. Somewhere in the white space beyond normal boundaries, 200 exorcists waited in formation. Still armed, still ready, still unable to complete their mission because the door they'd come through no longer led where heaven intended. Adam paced heaven's command center, fury radiating from every movement. He can't hold them forever, Lute observed. Doesn't matter. Adam's voice was tight. We don't negotiate with threats. We don't justify ourselves to demons. And we sure as hell don't let some reality-warping asshole dictate terms. Then what do we do? Adam stared at the monitors showing the inactive portal. The door that still existed, but no longer functioned. The machinery of judgment rendered impotent by someone who'd asked a question heaven couldn't answer. We wait, he said finally. And when he makes a mistake, we remind him why heaven doesn't answer to anyone. But deep down, in a part of him that still remembered being human before becoming the first man, Adam knew the truth. The stranger hadn't made a threat. He'd asked a question heaven had been avoiding for millennia, and avoiding it had been easier when no one with power had cared to ask. The machinery had stopped. The ideology remained. And the gap between the two was where everything would break. This part actually made me so mad, but in a good way, because heaven finally admitted the truth. The stranger got them to say out loud that they kill people just to save space and not because of justice or being good. It was kinda brutal, especially for Charlie when he heard them say, "It is just logistics because she cares so much." It is like finding out your boss fires people just because he wants a smaller office and not because they did a bad job. It feels good to see them get called out, though. It is quite interesting, because we don't know whether heaven was terrified here or just arrogant. It's quite interesting to see how everything will turn out in the next chapter. Heaven refused to acknowledge the problem for 3 days. 3 days of the portal hanging open and useless. 3 days of 200 exorcists suspended in white space awaiting orders that couldn't reach them because the passage no longer functioned as intended. 3 days of Adam demanding justification from beings who didn't answer to him, and Lut calculating scenarios that all ended the same way. The machinery had stopped. The ideology insisted it should continue. Something had to break. On the 4th day, Adam made his choice. He appeared at the portal's threshold, amplified his voice across hell's airspace, and delivered an ultimatum. "Return our soldiers, restore operational access, or we will consider this an act of war and respond accordingly." The stranger stood in the ruins of the Hazbin hotel, examining the declaration with the interest of someone cataloging increasingly desperate threats. "War requires 2 parties withstanding to declare it," he said, not bothering to raise his voice. The words carried anyway, reaching Adam through whatever mechanism allowed cross-dimensional conversation. "You have none. We have heaven's full authority to what enforce an agreement you unilaterally modified execute beings, without trial based on residential location. Maintain a schedule that one party negotiated under duress, and the other just shortened without consultation." Adam's response came edged with genuine fury. "We have maintained order between realms for millennia. We have prevented hell from becoming a threat to heaven's peace. You have operated a system that claims divine mandate while demonstrating mortal vulnerability." The stranger produced the angelic steel fragment, holding it where Adam could see through the portal. "Your weapons kill permanently. Demons, angels. No theological exception. If heaven's judgment were truly absolute, your enforcement tools wouldn't acknowledge equivalence. That's That's proof your authority is procedural, not inherent. You built instruments of termination and claimed only your targets would fall. But Carmilla Carmine ended one of your soldiers with a blade you provided. Your system contains its own refutation." Silence stretched across the dimensional gap. Lut's voice cut through it, colder and more calculated than Adam's rage. "You're stalling. Demanding justification you know we can't provide in terms you'd accept. What do you actually want? Compliance with agreed-upon terms, or acknowledgement that those terms were never legitimate and therefore require renegotiation between equals?" The stranger's tone remained level, neither of which heaven appears willing to offer. "Then we're at an impasse," Lut said. "No, you're at a decision point." He stepped toward the portal, still holding the fragment. "You can admit the extermination protocol was always enforcement through superior force rather than divine right. You can negotiate new terms with hell as a sovereign entity rather than defeated territory. Or you can insist on authority you can't justify while I continue preventing you from exercising it." Adam's laugh was ugly. "You think you can hold that portal closed forever?" "I'm not holding it closed. It remains open. I've simply corrected its destination parameters pending proper authorization for its intended use." The stranger examined the fragment. "But since you're unwilling to provide that authorization, and since the protocol itself violates the treaty structure it claims to operate under, I'm going to resolve this more directly." He inserted the fragment into the portal's edge, not physically. The gesture existed in that space between symbolic and literal, where beings with sufficient authority could treat metaphor as mechanism. The steel became evidence. Evidence became proof. Proof became grounds for administrative action. The protocol recognized contradiction. Its foundation, the assumption of heaven's absolute right to conduct scheduled purges, backed by weapons that acknowledged no divine immunity enforced through an agreement. One party had just modified, without consent, cracked under examination. Not explosively, not with fire or thunder, or any of the theatrical violence that usually accompanied cosmic-scale alterations. The way legal frameworks shift when someone demonstrates that the law was written by parties who'd exceeded their authority from inception. The sky above hell didn't shatter. It recalibrated. The constant background awareness that had hung over every sinner for millennia. The knowledge that angels would descend on schedule to cull the population simply ceased to register as inevitable. The extermination timer vanished from hell's collective consciousness. Not the portal, not heaven's architectural presence, just the mechanism that allowed scheduled access for the purpose of mass termination. The protocol that governed when and how angels could descend to kill without trial, without individual assessment, without anything except population control, dressed in theological language. Gone. Adam felt it happen. Felt the system respond to input it had never been designed to question. Felt protocols that had operated for millennia recognize fundamental contradiction and shut down to prevent cascading logical failure. "What did you just do?" His voice came out strangled. "Removed an unauthorized mechanism from operational status." The stranger withdrew the fragment. "The extermination protocol no longer functions. Your soldiers remain unharmed in holding. The portal remains architecturally intact. Heaven retains all legitimate authority it possessed. You've simply lost the ability to conduct scheduled killing in hell without hell's sovereign consent. You can't just..." "I already did." No triumph in the statement, no satisfaction. Just acknowledgement of completed action. The protocol contradicted its own enforcement structure. Systems that claim absolute authority while manufacturing exceptions to that authority have no standing. "I've corrected the error." Lute's voice came tight with barely controlled fury. "This is an act of war. No, this is an audit finding non-compliance and terminating the non-compliant mechanism. Heaven is welcome to petition hell's government for renewed terms if population control remains a concern. But unilateral access for the purpose of scheduled termination is no longer available. Our soldiers will be returned when you acknowledge this wasn't legitimate authority being temporarily interrupted, but illegitimate enforcement being permanently revoked." The stranger turned away from the portal. "I suggest you begin drafting new proposals, ones that treat hell as an entity with sovereignty rather than territory to be managed." Adam's scream of rage echoed across dimensions, then went silent as he presumably retreated to report failure to whatever hierarchy governed heaven's bureaucracy. The portal remained, open, inactive, a door that led nowhere heaven had authorized and could no longer be used for the purpose it had served since hell's creation. In the hotel ruins, Charlie stood with her hands pressed over her mouth. Not crying, not celebrating, just processing. "It's over?" Vaggie whispered. "No." Charlie's voice came out hollow. "The killing stopped. That's not the same as over." Lucifer Hazbin materialized beside them, staring at the unchanged but fundamentally different sky. The portal hung there architecturally present but functionally neutered. Heaven's door remained open. Heaven's access did not. "So, this is what it looks like," he said quietly, "when someone refuses the compromise." The stranger walked past him toward the hotel's shattered entrance. "You could have done this," Lucifer called after him. "Centuries ago. You have the power. You could have ended this the moment you arrived." "No." The stranger stopped, but didn't turn. "I could have prevented the current extermination. I couldn't have removed the protocol itself until heaven demonstrated it wouldn't voluntarily reform. I needed them to refuse justification, to insist on authority they couldn't defend, to choose enforcement over legitimacy. So you let people die to make a point. I let a system demonstrate it couldn't defend itself even when given opportunity. Now he turned. The deaths in the first wave were tragic, also inevitable under the existing framework. I couldn't prevent them without establishing that prevention was necessary rather than interference. Now heaven knows someone exists who doesn't recognize their authority, who examined their justification and found it lacking, who removed their ability to act because they refused to demonstrate they had right to act in the first place. That's still letting people die. Yes, no apology, no deflection. I prioritized systemic correction over immediate rescue. You're free to judge that choice. But the protocol is gone. Heaven can't restart it without hell's consent. And hell now knows that consent was never actually required for them to refuse. He continued into the hotel, leaving Lucifer standing in the rubble. Alastor emerged from shadows that shouldn't have existed in the wreckage, his smile intact, but something in his eyes suggesting recalculation. Well, that was anticlimactic. Was it? Vaggie gestured at the portal. He just deleted an entire cosmic mechanism. How is that anticlimactic? Because there was no struggle, no final battle, just administrative action. Alastor's grin widened slightly. I rather liked it, actually. All that power, and what does he use it for paperwork? Charlie moved toward the hotel, each step careful among the debris. He didn't save anyone. He just removed the thing that was killing them on schedule. Isn't that the same thing? Vaggie asked. No. Charlie's certainty surprised even herself. Salvation implies being rescued, made safe, given something you couldn't get yourself. He just took away an illegitimate threat. Now we have to actually prove redemption works. Without the pressure of scheduled termination, but also without the excuse that we were operating under impossible conditions. She stopped at what had once been the lobby entrance, looking at the ruins of her dream, given physical form. The hotel had survived the extermination through Alastor's barrier and sheer luck. It wouldn't survive much longer without serious reconstruction. Now they have time, she said quietly. That doesn't mean they'll use it. Across hell, sinners emerged from hiding with the confused caution of beings who just realized the sky wasn't falling on schedule. Overlords assessed the new landscape. Carmilla Carmine received reports that angelic steel was about to become significantly less valuable as defensive necessity and significantly more valuable as proof that heaven's authority had never been absolute. Vox's screen struggled to explain what had happened. The extermination had stopped, not been defeated, not been negotiated away, simply stopped functioning as a mechanism. His algorithms couldn't generate clicks from bureaucratic correction of unauthorized protocol. So he went with heaven loses details, unclear, and let his audience project their own narratives. In the white space beyond normal boundaries, 200 exorcists waited in formation. Still armed, still ready. Still unable to return home or complete their mission because someone had removed the system they'd operated within for millennia. Several were beginning to question whether following orders constituted sufficient moral justification when the orders themselves derived from authority that apparently couldn't survive basic scrutiny. Back in Heaven's command center, Adam stood surrounded by screens showing an inactive portal, suspended soldiers, and a hell that was no longer counting down to its next scheduled death. Lute stood beside him, expression neutral. Orders, sir. I don't know. The admission seemed to hurt. We can't access hell. We can't retrieve our people. We can't even file a formal complaint because there's no diplomatic channel with an entity that doesn't recognize heaven's standing. He turned to her. What do we do when our entire enforcement structure is based on assumptions someone just proved wrong? We adapt, or we break. Lute's tone carried no emotion. I suggest we begin drafting proposals for negotiated access, with Hell as a sovereign entity rather than managed territory. That's admitting we were wrong. No, that's admitting we no longer have the power to insist we were right. In the hotel ruins, the stranger stood in what had been Charlie's office, examining the extermination countdown calendar that had hung on the wall. The numbers had vanished. Not erased, simply became irrelevant. Time no longer marched towards scheduled annihilation. Charlie appeared in the doorway. Why did you really do this? Because systems that kill on schedules offend me. Because authority without justification deserves to be questioned. Because someone edited cosmic law without authorization, and I've made it my business to audit such things. Those are reasons, not the reason. He smiled faintly. You're perceptive. The reason is simpler. I refuse to exist in frameworks where beings with power can enforce violence on the powerless and call it divine order. I've spent an eternity dismantling such systems. This one happened to share my name. Will you stay? Help us rebuild? No. The answer was gentle but immediate. This is your kingdom, your project, your choice to make redemption work or fail. I've removed the machinery that made failure irrelevant. What you do with the opportunity is yours alone, and if heaven tries to restart the protocol, they can't. Not without Hell's consent. Not without justification they've proven unable to provide. The mechanism is gone. The ideology may persist, but heaven can no longer enforce it through scheduled access. He moved toward the door, though I suspect they'll try negotiation eventually. Bureaucracies hate admitting error, but they hate operational paralysis more. Charlie watched him prepare to leave. This being who wore her father's name, who'd dismantled millennia of accepted cruelty through what amounted to cosmic administrative correction, who'd refused to be hero or savior and settled for removing illegitimate machinery instead. Thank you, she said. I didn't do this for gratitude. I did it because the protocol was wrong. He paused at the threshold. But you're welcome. He left the hotel, left Hell, left the entire framework with the same understated finality he'd brought to every exit. The portal remained open in the sky, empty, waiting for negotiations that would probably take centuries. A door that heaven had assumed was theirs to open whenever they deemed Hell needed culling, now requiring permission from the beings they'd been killing. The machinery had stopped. The consequences were just beginning, and in the silence, where the extermination countdown used to echo Hell, discovered something it had never possessed before. Not safety, not salvation, not redemption earned through suffering. Just time. What they did with it was their choice. Finally, the morning after the extermination that didn't happen, Hell woke up to silence, not peace. Silence. The absence of the countdown that had ticked in the back of every sinner's consciousness for as long as anyone could remember. The missing weight of scheduled death hanging over the horizon. Katie Killjoy sat at her news desk, staring at a teleprompter that kept trying to generate content from a crisis that had simply ended. Her producers scrambled to find an angle. Heaven defeated felt inaccurate. Purge canceled implied temporary reprieve. Extermination protocol deleted by unknown entity didn't fit the 30-second soundbite format. She went with improvisation. So, that happened. Her smile was sharp, but genuine confusion showed underneath. For those of you who spent yesterday hiding in bunkers waiting for angels that never arrived, congratulations, you're still dead, but not additionally dead. Updates as this extremely weird situation develops. The broadcast cut to commercial. Ads for angelic weapons that were suddenly defensive tools rather than survival necessities. Real estate in districts that no longer needed to account for annual devastation. Insurance policies that would require complete restructuring now that permanent death wasn't a scheduled occurrence. Hell's economy would adapt. It always did. At the Hazbin Hotel, Charlie stood in the ruins with a clipboard and absolutely no idea where to start. The building had survived the first wave through Alastor's barrier and architectural spite. It wouldn't survive much longer without serious reconstruction. Vaggie appeared beside her with coffee that tasted like burnt regret. Carmilla's sending a crew pro bono. Apparently she's feeling something approximating gratitude. For what? For proof that heaven's weapons weren't divine mandate. For someone demonstrating that authority requires justification. Vaggie sipped her own coffee. Also, she needs to maintain good relations with the hotel that somehow attracted an entity capable of deleting cosmic mechanisms. Charlie accepted the mug without drinking. We didn't do anything. He just removed the thing that was killing everyone. And now we have to prove redemption actually works. Without the excuse that we were operating under impossible conditions. Without scheduled annihilation forcing urgency. She gestured at the ruins. Us. Trying to help people who've spent eternity being told they're irredeemable. A figure appeared at the hotel's destroyed entrance. A sinner. Young-looking despite decades in hell. Cautious in the way beings who'd learned to expect violence carried themselves. Is this still open? The voice came out uncertain. The redemption thing. I heard you were trying to... Yes. Charlie set down her clipboard, suddenly focused. Yes, we're still open. We're just rebuilding. But if you want to try, we'll figure it out together. The sinner stepped through the threshold. Not hopeful, not convinced. Just willing to attempt something that had previously seemed pointless because angels would kill them on schedule regardless of improvement. I don't know if I can change, they admitted. Neither do I. Charlie's honesty surprised even herself. But you have time now. That's more than anyone here had before. Upstairs in a room that had somehow avoided structural damage. Lucifer, Morningstar, King of Hell, Father. Administrator of Damnation, sat with his daughter's project blueprints spread across a desk. For millennia, he'd managed Hell's bureaucracy, organized its hierarchies, maintained its systems, accepted the extermination as the price of autonomy, and never questioned whether that price was legitimate or simply the best offer from beings who'd already decided what he was allowed to have. Someone else had questioned it. Had examined the system Hell's King had helped build and found it operating on assumptions that couldn't survive scrutiny. The door opened without knocking. Alistair, because of course. Your Majesty. Brooding productively, I hope? Thinking. Lucifer didn't look up. About choices I made that I told myself were necessary. About compromises I accepted because refusing them meant risking everything. And now that someone's demonstrated you could have refused, Alastair's grin remained fixed, but something in his tone suggested genuine curiosity. No. The answer came quiet. I'll help her rebuild the hotel, support her project, actually be present for my daughter instead of hiding in a workshop making rubber ducks, because engaging with Hell meant acknowledging I'd built a kingdom on compromises I pretended were choices. You're still here because you find chaos entertaining. Scares you, Lucifer observed. Fascinates me. Fear and fascination often share an address. Alistair moved toward the door. But yes, the realization that someone could turn off the stage lights and none of my performance would matter. That's a new experience. I'm not entirely certain I enjoy it. No, sir. That's acknowledging we lack the power to enforce authority that can't withstand scrutiny. The protocol contradicted its own foundation. Someone noticed. Someone with capability to remove it. Lute's report contained no emotion. We adapt or we accept permanent operational paralysis in that domain. Now I understand what Charlie's been trying to tell me. Lucifer set down the blueprints. She wanted me to believe redemption mattered, I told her it was naive because the system didn't allow for it. But the system was negotiable. I just never tried to renegotiate. Will you now? Alastair's smile widened fractionally. Character growth. How tedious. True. Though I must admit the chaos has become significantly more interesting since we acquired an auditor who treats cosmic law like a filing error. Alastair examined his claws. Someone who can simply remove mechanisms he finds illegitimate. Someone who exists entirely beyond the theatrical rules I've mastered. He vanished into shadows, leaving Lucifer alone with blueprints for a hotel, dedicated to proving sinners could change when given time that no longer counted down to scheduled annihilation. Across the city, Vox's screens ran continuous coverage that kept pivoting between angles. Heaven Backs Down played well with demons who wanted validation. Mysterious entity disrupts cosmic order attracted conspiracy theorists. Hashtag 2 Lucifers remained trending because the internet never let go of good drama. But underneath the noise, a quieter truth emerged. Hell had time. Sinners who'd spent eternity knowing permanent death arrived on a calendar, now faced existence without that certainty. Some would use the time for redemption, some for worse behavior without consequences. Most would simply continue being exactly what they'd been broken. People making broken choices in a realm designed for punishment. The difference was that now those choices belonged to them. In heaven's administrative chambers, Lute stood before assembled authorities, explaining how an enforcement mechanism that had functioned for millennia had been permanently disabled by an entity that didn't recognize their jurisdiction. Recommendations. The voice came from someone whose rank exceeded Lute's significantly. We begin drafting proposals for negotiated access. Treat Hell as sovereign territory rather than defeated rebellion. Acknowledge that population control through unilateral force is no longer operationally viable. That's admitting we lacked authority. Adam wasn't present for the discussion. He'd retreated to whatever space heaven provided for beings processing the realization that violence backed by superior force wasn't the same as legitimate authority, and that someone existing beyond their framework had made that distinction operationally relevant. Heaven would adapt. Bureaucracies always did. But the adaptation would involve negotiations with Hell as equals, rather than oversight of defeated territory. That would take time, probably centuries. The 200 suspended exorcists would remain in holding until terms were established. They'd accepted their orders as legitimate, because legitimacy had never been questioned by anyone with power to challenge it. Now it had been. At the portal's edge, where dimensional boundaries met and cosmic mechanisms operated, according to rules most beings couldn't perceive, the stranger stood alone. The structure remained intact. Heaven's architectural access persisted. But the extermination protocol, the specific mechanism that allowed scheduled mass termination, was gone. Deleted. Removed from operational capacity because it had failed to justify itself when examined. Hell and Heaven would negotiate new terms eventually. Probably badly. Possibly resulting in renewed conflict. But any agreement would require Hell's consent rather than capitulation, and that distinction mattered. His work here was finished. Leaving without ceremony. How appropriate. He turned. Lucifer Hazbin stood a few paces away, not confrontational, just present. You don't belong at farewells, Hell's king continued. You came for an audit. Audit's concluded. Makes sense you just go. Yes. The protocol's gone. Heaven can't restart it. But they'll find other ways to pressure Hell. Other mechanisms. Other enforcement structures. Probably? The stranger showed no concern. Those will require negotiation, treaty, consent. They won't be scheduled killing justified by superior force. If Heaven develops new legitimate concerns about Hell's population, they'll have to present them to Hell's government and reach agreement. That's how sovereignty functions. You really don't care what happens next, do you? I care that the machinery was illegitimate and is now removed. What hell and heaven do with the absence of that machinery is their concern. He paused. Though I hope your daughter succeeds. Her project deserves opportunity to prove itself or fail on its own merits rather than being rendered moot by scheduled annihilation. She thinks you saved everyone. I removed an unauthorized mechanism. That's not salvation. That's administrative correction. The stranger's expression softened fractionally. But she's young. She can be forgiven for confusing the two. Lucifer Hazbin studied his impossible counterpart. This being who shared his name, who'd examined the system Hell's King had built, and found it operating on assumptions that couldn't survive questioning who'd deleted a millennia-old protocol with the same casual authority someone might use to cancel an invalid contract. What are you really? Someone who believes authority requires consent. That systems which kill on schedules have no standing. That choice matters more than guaranteed outcomes. He moved toward the dimensional boundary. I'm also someone who has other frameworks to examine, other audits to conduct, other mechanisms that mistake enforcement for legitimacy. Will we see you again? Unlikely. Your cosmology has been corrected. What you build in the corrected space is yours to determine. He stepped through the boundary and vanished. Not dramatically, just ceased being present in this framework. The portal remained. The deletion persisted. But the entity who'd performed it was gone. Lucifer Hazbin stood alone at the edge of nothing, processing the realization that someone had defended Hell's sovereignty without asking permission and without expecting gratitude. Choice restored, that's all it had been. At the Hazbin Hotel, Charlie helped the new arrival, the sinner who'd asked if redemption was still open, navigate the ruins toward a room that had survived structural damage. What happens if I fail? They asked quietly. Then you fail. But you'll fail because you chose to try and couldn't follow through, not because angels killed you before you had the chance. Charlie opened a door to a space that would need serious work, but was habitable. Redemption isn't guaranteed. It's just possible now, for as long as you're willing to work at it. The sinner stepped inside, looked around, made the choice to stay and attempt something that had never worked before, but at least now had time to be attempted. Downstairs, Vaggie found Charlie standing in the lobby, staring at the ruins. "We can rebuild this," Vaggie said. "I know." Charlie's voice carried weight it hadn't before. But rebuilding the hotel is the easy part. Rebuilding trust that change matters. Proving that sinners can improve when improvement isn't immediately erased by scheduled execution, that's the actual work. Yeah. Charlie picked up her clipboard. The actual work. They began planning reconstruction, while Hell adjusted to existence without a countdown. While Heaven began the long process of acknowledging that enforcement through superior force wasn't the same as legitimate authority. While sinners processed the realization that permanent death was no longer guaranteed to arrive on schedule. The extermination was over. The consequences were just beginning. And in the absence of machinery that had killed on calendars and called it divine maintenance, Hell discovered something it had never possessed. Not redemption, not salvation, not guaranteed improvement, just time and the freedom to choose what to do with it. The show went on, not because anyone had fixed it, but because no one was forcing it to end. So the story ends not with a big party, but with just quiet time, and honestly, that is perfect. The stranger did not magically fix everyone. He just gave them a chance to fix themselves without dying. It is scary, though, because now they have no excuses left, and they actually have to do the work to be better people. Because if they fail, it's on them, not the angels, anymore. How do you think the Hazbin Hotel will actually work now that the pressure is off? Or will everyone just get lazy without a deadline? I'd love to hear your theories on what happens next.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.